The following teleconference is recorded for David Borden with StopTheDrugWar.org on Wednesday, April 6, 2016 at 11 a.m. Central Time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience in holding. We now have your speakers in conference. Please be aware that each of your lines is in a listen-only mode. At the conclusion of today's presentation, we'll open the floor for questions. At that time, instructions will be given as to the procedure to follow if you would like to ask a question. It is now my pleasure to turn today's conference over to David Borden. Sir, you may begin.
Thank you all for taking the time to join our teleconference today. I am David Borden, Executive Director of StopTheDrugWar.org. I'm pleased today that we have presentations by leading members of the national legislatures of Mexico and Canada, as well as leading advocates from those two countries. Before we launch into the presentations, I note that on the 19th to the 21st of this month, the United Nations will hold its highest level session on drug policy in almost 20 years, the UN General Assembly's Special Session on the World Drug Problem, or UNGASS. My organization coordinates a primarily U.S. coalition, working with coalitions in other countries, which advocates on global drug policy from a U.S. perspective, that is, U.S. foreign policy and the U.S.'s diplomatic stances on drug policy in international fora. As part of this work, we have organized a sign-on statement to the UN, as well as more recently, a sign-on letter to President Obama regarding the UNGASS, the latter of which has garnered more than 250 organizational signatories, including many of the nation's leading organizations working in civil and human rights, HIV/AIDS, faith-based organizing, and many other types of groups. Our coalition has argued that while U.S. agencies and diplomats are doing important work internationally, promoting agendas such as alternatives to incarceration, public health approaches, and some human rights reforms, in key respects we see the current U.S. position for UNGASS as taking a short-term approach which stops short of crucial reforms called for by UN agencies and U.S. allies while failing to address new realities. We believe a stronger U.S. stance on these issues would leave a legacy in global drug policy that is better aligned to the direction President Obama has helped steer domestic policy. With respect to the legalization issue specifically, the salient points for global drug policy are the 3 UN drug conventions, which include language that is problematic for legalization, and how moves toward legalization get interpreted in the face of such language until the treaties can be updated. Regrettably, the U.S. delegation opposed having any discussion of possible treaty reforms at this UNGASS, although statements made by State Department officials at various times have argued for the right of countries to set their own drug policies, including going the legalization route if they choose this. Our coalition has argued that the U.S.'s position with respect to the drug conventions is likely to face shrinking credibility internationally as legalization spreads to more states, and especially if, or more likely when, Congress moves to provide federal legality of marijuana for such states. Our letter to President Obama urged that the U.S. delegation clarify that, quote, commitment to the 3 UN drug conventions, the language used in the preliminary U.S. UNGASS document, does not mean that these treaties, written variously between 27 and 55 years ago, should remain unchanged, and that the U.S. should support a proposal offered by several countries for a UN expert advisory group, which would study the tensions that have arisen in the international drug control regime due to marijuana legalization and other issues, and to lay out the range of options for moving forward. With that, we turn now to our esteemed elected officials. I am grateful that we are joined today by Nathaniel Erskine-Smith of Canada and Laura Angelica Rojas Hernandez of Mexico, the two of whom argued the pro side in a debate on marijuana legalization at the UN Interparliamentary Union last February. First, we'll hear from Mr. Erskine-Smith. Erskine-Smith is a member of Canada's House of Commons, where he represents the Toronto, Ontario riding of Beaches, East York. Erskine-Smith was elected in October 2015 and serves as part of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Liberal majority government, which campaigned on legalizing and regulating marijuana. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much. So thanks everyone for joining the call. I want to start with a simple and broad proposition, but the war on drugs is a failure. It causes more harm than it proposes to solve, and it's not a new message. This message was delivered to Kofi Annan in a famous letter in 1998, and it's now delivered by Kofi Annan himself, and the evidence supporting the claim is overwhelming. So we know prohibition prevents victims of drug use from seeking medical help. We know that prohibition imposes criminal records on users, negatively affecting their lives far more than drug use itself in some cases. We know that it's costly, displacing resources better spent on education, poverty reduction, and health. We know that it creates the conditions for organized crime to profit. So the underground market alone is the cause of far more deaths than drug use or abuse, whether that's through overdoses as a result of the underground market or gang violence. I could go on and on. I've only got 5 minutes. So let me turn to Canada. Now, we are moving away from prohibition's failed policies. As David noted, we promised to legalize marijuana in the recent election. The former Toronto police chief, Bill Blair, has been tasked with coordinating that effort. And now in Canada, given our federation, a move away from incarceration, from prohibition to a regulatory model requires cooperation with the provinces. So in the case of alcohol and tobacco, for example, provinces regulate the distribution and sale of those substances, and much like those substances, it will be open to provinces to regulate the product as they determine to be best once we as a federal government remove it from the criminal code. So the first step, and that Mr. Blair has moved forward with, is establishing a task force of expert policymakers as well as provincial and territorial bodies to work with the federal government to put policies in place going forward as we move beyond prohibition. Now, it's hard to say when the final policy will be put forward, when legalization will in fact happen. So public or private distribution model has to be worked out. Production models have to be worked out. So personally, and I say this now, I'm a backbencher in the Liberal government. I don't set the policy, as it were, but I have been advocating for personal grow limits. I think it's incredibly important to make sure that we don't over-commercialize the market and where we see increased usage occurring. So it's very important that we have rules for personal growing, rules for limiting access to youth. Mr. Blair spoke about this at length. Rules for driving impaired and related testing, rules for smoking in public, edibles and oils, commercial advertising, another important topic. If we take a public health approach seriously, we will need to restrict commercial advertising of the product. Now, we will look to other jurisdictions. My own view is that Uruguay's focus on a public health approach is a good jurisdiction to look to. Regardless, this is not an overnight process. We're not going to have this done by the end of 2016, but I'm hopeful that we're going to have this done by the end of 2017. In the interim, there is the issue of continuing arrests. Now, my government needs to treat this more seriously than it is. I will continue to be vocal on this topic, whether we are decriminalizing, which is seems to be off the table, unfortunately, but we should, at the very least, be issuing a directive to Crown Counsel to not proceed with arrests. And we actually had a judge in December say, I'm not going to be the last judge to throw someone in jail for the simple possession of marijuana, not when the Prime Minister has said that this substance is going to be legalized. So we have to treat that seriously. In the end, we'll also want to look at suspending convictions for simple possession at the very least, possibly low-level trafficking offenses where weapons have not been involved and there's been no violence. With respect to other drugs, a more cautious approach is warranted, but the same problems of prohibition apply, and we remain committed as a government to a public health approach, and that means harm reduction. Models like Insight's Safe Injection Clinic in Vancouver. The federal government has recently looked at approving other sites, so I'm hopeful that we will have a safe injection clinic soon in Toronto as well. And for all of this to happen, the conventions need to be flexible. They need to acknowledge the differences between kinds of drugs, that drugs should be regulated differently according to their different harms. And the conventions will need to be grounded in evidence that a public health approach, reducing harms, is the path forward. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you again very much for joining us. Our next speaker is Senator Laura Angelica Rojas Hernandez, who has served in Mexico's Senate since 2009, and before that in Mexico's Chamber of Deputies from 2006. Senator Rojas is a member of Mexico's National Action Party, the PAN, and chairs the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Organizations. Thank you for joining us, Senator.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Well, first I will give my comments on the UNGASS, and secondly, I will speak on the national debate in Mexico on marijuana uses for medical purposes. Well, first of all, UNGASS 2016 represents a major first step before the international community gathers in 2019 to review the fulfillment of the objectives settled in the Political Declaration and Action Plan of 2009. Therefore, the fact that the draft of the political document that will be adopted on April and that was agreed on the 59th session of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs places the individual at the center of drug policy and adopts a perspective of common and shared responsibilities constitutes an important change. Also, the draft document emphasizes the need of a new equilibrium between multiple approaches, such as public health, human rights, gender, and prevention. Notwithstanding this, there are also certain shortcomings that should be addressed, if not by the General Assembly, definitely at the 2019 review process. This includes a lack of recognition of the relative inefficacy of demand and offer reduction policies, and the absence of an acknowledgement of the high costs that the prohibitionist and punitive approaches have generated. But most importantly, the draft document does not reflect the link existing between this agenda and the one on sustainable development adopted last September at the United Nations. This special session is one of the first steps towards the 2019 review process of the Political Declaration and Action Plan, and therefore has the potential to set the basis on which discussions will be held for the next 3 years. On this regard, the international community should continue to work towards the establishment of indicators that could help measure the impact of drug policies on people's lives and their rights. Also, the communication and coordination between UN agencies that should be involved in the process, but for some reasons have been left out, and other specialized bodies will be crucial in the development of a more balanced and coherent perspective on how to deal with the world drug problem. And finally, something that may not be feasible for UNGASS, but that should be definitely placed on the table in 2019. A thorough review of the 3 conventions on drug control, acknowledging the highly detrimental effects of the current approaches. On this aspect, we should be more honest about the so-called flexibility of implementation that it is offered by these treaties and acknowledge that there should be a wider margin of action for countries to be able to define their own drug policy, taking into consideration their national and regional contexts. In order to be able to achieve this, the international community should examine the possibility of establishing an analysis mechanism as in working group of experts, for example, with a mandate to formulate recommendations aimed at the modernization of the international system of drugs control towards the 2019 review process. From a longer-term perspective, the creation of a special procedure within the UN Human Rights Council to follow up and monitor the respect of human rights in the context of the enforcement of drug policies should also be considered. Well, on the other hand, in Mexico, in the recent few months, we have been dialoguing of the use of mainly of the medical purposes of marijuana regulation. During the past few months, there have been substantial efforts, both from the legislative and the executive powers, to discuss this topic in multiple fora, which undoubtedly have contributed to overcome past prejudices on the use of certain controlled substances, particularly marijuana. As it has been noted by Senator Roberto Gil Suárez, Speaker of the Mexican Senate, the public hearings on alternatives of the regulation of marijuana organized by the Congress that took place on January and February have shown that there is a significant consensus on issues such as the medical and therapeutic uses of cannabinoid derivatives and the importance to find alternatives to consumers, criminalization, and incarceration, as well as the need to consider an increase on consumption thresholds. The recreational use of marijuana, however, is a topic still pending of further discussion in order to overcome differences that still exist among numerous actors. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you again, Senator, for joining us and providing that critique of the current diplomatic situation and introduction to the legislative action in Mexico. Next, we hear from Donald McPherson. Donald previously worked as North America's first drug policy coordinator for the City of Vancouver in British Columbia, and he now heads the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition. He is a leading Canadian advocate for drug policy reform. Thanks for joining us, Don.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon. It's great to be here with my colleagues from Canada and Mexico, and of course the U.S. reform movement. The Canadian Drug Policy Coalition has long contended that it is important to work with organizations and the government in Mexico to help move our friends in the U.S. forward on drug policy issues. It is great that things are moving in all three countries on the cannabis file. In Canada, the issue of cannabis legalization has been discussed for many years. In 2003 and 2004, there was an attempt to decriminalize cannabis for personal possession that was put forward by the Liberal government of the day, but it didn't pass. Canada also has a well-developed medical cannabis infrastructure that's been evolving since 2000, and that will come into play as we move towards regulation. Currently, 60% of Canadians support creating a legal regulated market for cannabis, and it's great that the government is listening to the Canadians, Canadian citizens. This has been the case for a number of years. We have advocated that civil society be very involved in the process that the government is developing, and we're delighted that the government is developing a process. We urge them to not take too long with getting this out of the gate, and we're not sure who's going to be involved, but we think civil society has a great deal of expertise to contribute to whatever process that unfolds in the near future. Also, the public health community in Canada is very well prepared for this process, and in fact has been calling for legal regulation of cannabis for a number of years as a way to begin to create healthy contexts for cannabis use, something that is not going to go away. Cannabis is with us to stay. We understand creating legal regulated markets within our Federation of Provinces and Territories will take some time, perhaps up to 1 or 2 years, but encourage the government to move quickly as they can to eliminate the illegal market and stop enforcing the prohibition for possession of cannabis in Canada while this process is taking place. Policing authorities need clarity on how to proceed in this transitional space, and I'm heartened by Mr. Erskine's commitment to try and get the government to address this issue of enforcing a law which the government itself has said is not is something that needs to be changed. Finally, with regard to the UN meeting coming up in a few days, we hope that Canada and other countries, perhaps Mexico, will be clear in that forum that the international drug treaties need to be reformed. With Uruguay, the U.S., and soon Canada in legalizing cannabis, in our opinion, which is a breach of the treaties, it is time that the UN create a process to talk about treaty reform coming out of the UN meeting. This could take the form of an expert committee. It's a great opportunity for Canada to initiate a multilateral process with other countries like Mexico and Uruguay and hopefully the U.S. To address the problem with the treaties, which clearly need to be updated, as has been mentioned before. So we hope Canada is firm in its commitment. We have no doubt that this government will move towards regulation, and we await to be involved in the process to see how we can shape one of the best systems in the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. And finally, we will hear from Aram Barra. Aram is a program officer at Mexicans United Against Crime and the Transform Drug Policy Foundation, and he is a leading Mexican advocate for drug policy reform. Of particular interest today is that Barra is also a member of the Mexican Society for Responsible and Tolerant Personal Use, or SMART, and through that he is a party to one of the Cannabis Club cases, like one that recently had a victory at the Mexico Supreme Court, but one of a set of cases that are currently pending in the Supreme Court. Thank you for joining us, Aram.
Thank you, David, and thank you to the organizers of the panel. As mentioned, my name is Aram Barra, and I currently work for Mexico United Against Crime, which is a non-governmental organization that for 20 years has been working on culture of lawfulness and culture of denouncing. And I think this is interesting to note because after almost 15 years of work on these subject areas, we have now realized that it's impossible to procure justice and security if we do not reform drug policy and establish regulated drug markets. It is because of this that, as Dave mentioned, we have dedicated at least 5 years now to this objective, and more recently through the judicial power of Mexico. Mexico has taken, in this sense, to the courts on the matter. In fact, and as Dave mentioned, my organization, MUCD, undertook a legal strategy that brought us to the Supreme Court last November 4th, in which a ruling in our favor permitted not only 4 people, which are board members of MUCD, to grow, possess, and use cannabis for personal use, but much more importantly, in my opinion, it declared 5 key articles of our general health law. Those are the foundation of prohibition in Mexico to be unconstitutional. In a historic vote, the first room of the highest constitutional body in the country granted an injunction to a group of 4 citizens who questioned the constitutionality of the prohibition of marijuana. It is very important to say that the main purpose behind this writ that we started in 2013 was to question whether liberal democracies can intervene in the private lives of individuals to prohibit the deliberate and conscious consumption of substances such as cannabis. In a context, in Mexico, in a context of violence and lack of political leadership, we believe the Supreme Court of Justice of the nation behaves at the height of the debate to endorse the supremacy of human rights of Mexican citizens. With this demand, with this ruling in our favor, the country's highest court declared, as I said, unconstitutional the provisions contained in Articles 235, 237, 245, 247, and 248 of the General Health Law. This is, it accepts that the prohibitionist policy for cannabis is unconstitutional as it is disproportionate and it unnecessarily affects the fundamental rights of people. Now, the consequences of this ruling are, in my view, twofold. First, it lays the path through which other people can protect their human rights in court if they decide to do so. In fact, we know of around 200 new cases that are currently being litigated on the judicial power of Mexico. In the case of Mexico, differently from the U.S. and Canada, if 4 more cases are ruled on the same sense, uninterrupted with at least 4 votes in the same chamber, this creates jurisprudence and law is therefore changed. Secondly, and probably more important, it has opened up a long-needed debate in the country. The current president of the Senate, the Speaker of the Upper House, as Senator Rojas just mentioned, and also a party colleague of Senator Rojas, Senator Roberto Gil, opened up a rather interesting debate right after the ruling of the court that, in my view, has attempted to look at as many policy models as possible, calling on experts, on academics, and on people who use drugs themselves to define a new model to control drug policy in Mexico in response to the ruling of the court. In fact, yesterday, Senator Gil introduced a bill at the Senate that proposes to strictly regulate the cannabis market through a license system that is rather similar to the Canadian medical model. If passed as it currently stands, which we don't expect it to do, the model would integrate first access for personal purposes through self-cultivation and the definition of a state monopoly, very much in line with the Uruguayan model. And secondly, an access to medical and therapeutical cannabis, both through the pharmaceutical system, but also through more traditional means. Regardless of how the legislative debate moves forward, what is clear today is that we cannot continue with the current punitive drug system. In fact, the Supreme Court of Mexico confirms with this ruling what many of us already knew, and that is the drug policy today violates human rights, and it violates human rights, that our Constitution defends. Before this reality, a radical change is needed, and in how we will deal with drugs in the future. Finally, and to touch a tiny bit on the special session on drugs from the General Assembly, while we would have liked to bring a more profound policy change at the domestic level as part of Mexico's official position for UNGASS, reality has proven over the past 3 years to be a lot tougher to change than our expectations intended. Therefore, Mexico, as Senator Rojas already mentioned, as well as many other countries from Latin America, will simply come into the UNGASS rooms to say that it is very clear to us that the current model is not working, but that's it. What the rest of the world may do with that statement, that is the question I think that lays before the UNGASS. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Aram, and thank you once again to all of our speakers. All of our speakers, I believe, are remaining on the call for questions. I'm also available for questions, and though our focus today has been Canada and Mexico, we're also glad to talk about the U.S. if anyone wants to, or other aspects of international drug policy. I believe that our operator has instructions now to media as to how to get on the call to ask a question.
Yes, sir. At this time, we will open the floor for questions. If you would like to ask a question, please dial the star key followed by the 1 key on your touch-tone phone now. Questions will be taken in the order in which they are received. If at any time you'd like to remove yourself from the questioning queue, please dial star 2. Again, to ask a question, dial star 1 now. We'll pause just a moment to poll for questions. The first question will come from Rafael Bernal with the Hill newspaper. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. So I have a double question for especially for the Mexican delegation, but also U.S. and Canada can skip in. So given the violence and all the negative effects of the narco economy and the narco culture, is it going after marijuana at this juncture a bit of too little, too late? The other drugs might generate more profit, in fact. And the other thing is also Mexico too late to the game in terms of recreational marijuana, where the industry, the drugs that be preferred by consumers are mostly produced in places like Colorado and British Columbia. Thank you.
Do you want to jump in, Senator?
Yes, I will. Well, on the question of if we are too late to the game on recreational, well, I have to say that yesterday, next week, formally, Senator Roberto Gil will present this initiative that Aram has mentioned. And I'm sure that that initiative will have a very strong support for many senators. I don't know if we are coming too late to the game, but I think the most important thing is that we are taking the decision to change the rules the rules of the game in Mexico on this topic. Thank you.
I'll also chip in. I think studies that look at what the income of cartels is coming from cannabis differ quite greatly in how they measure the market, and thus in how much of that income, how much does that income mean. So I don't think the argument is necessarily this is what will stop or completely make disappear cartels. However, it will take away a large proportion of their capital, and thus it'll take away power from them. Whether organized crime has diversified into other subjects, I think that's not only natural, but also a reality already today. However, more than just making the argument of the money, I think the second argument is there's a recent study published by CIDE University in Mexico that looks at federal prisons in the country, and it says that 60% of federal prisoners are there today for drug crimes. Out of those 60%, 38% are simple possession of cannabis without the proven intent to sell, and without any violence or another crime associated with the detention. This is around 12,000 of our federal prisoners, or around 1/3 of our federal prisoners, are there for simple possession of cannabis in a country where 98% of kidnappings go unresolved. So I think there's a second argument to make with, on a regulated market, by taking away the bad investment that we do in policing and enforcement of prohibition, we can redirect our resources and do enforcement in other hideous crimes that really affect society. Lastly, on whether we've missed on the opportunity of the market, even though Ambassador Brownfield from the U.S. Still defends that the international conventions allow for a level of flexibility that gives permission or gives the room for countries to do policy experimentation around legalization. One thing that is categorically prohibited in the conventions is international commerce of these products of scheduled drugs. And so in that sense, even though the legal cannabis market in the U.S. or in Canada has proliferated, it's still there's no permission for exports, at least legally, or imports in the other way. And so in that sense, I think we will see somehow of a protected market in Mexico as well as we move forward, and until we change the convention.
Okay, may I say another idea in order to complement the which Aram has mentioned? The approach that the approach on this topic is currently in Mexico is a human rights approach, as it is not related directly with violence, because we think that in order to reduce significantly violence, we should legalize all the drugs, and in this time we are only dialoguing on marijuana. Tough drugs such as cocaine, heroin, or other drugs are not now in our discussion. So this approach is more a human rights approach. Is more as the highest court decided, it is a right to consume marijuana, and also we agree on the benefits of using marijuana for medical purposes. Cartel drugs we know that they are not going to disappear just because we legalize marijuana or for recreational or for medical purposes or both. That's another discussion, that's another discussion, and has to be with a lot of many other issues. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question will come from Kristen Gwynn with High Times. Please go ahead.
Hi, my question is for Mr. Erskine-Smith, and it is whether legalization in the U.S. has been influential to discussions about particular regulations in Canada as you move forward looking to legalize, and whether there are any regulations in particular that you think are effective or ineffective that you would stray from, and also whether the emergence of the cannabis industry in the U.S. is informing your decision to make a public versus a private model.
So first, the legalization efforts in the United States have been helpful to show Canadians who are a bit concerned about regulation and legalization that it is possible and that it can be done in a more orderly way. I think it's always helpful to learn from other jurisdictions' mistakes. So I think Colorado in particular adopted a commercial model that doesn't quite fit with the public health approach that I think we'd like to move towards. So the the Center of Addiction and Mental Health in Canada has actually come out in favor of legalization, but come out in favor of legalization in a very regulated way and focusing on public health. And that is closer to the model that I think we would pursue.
Mm-hmm. And could you just elaborate a little bit more about Colorado in particular, and what specifics of the law you think don't hold up to a public health approach?
So specifically, and different jurisdictions will want to treat or regulate the sale and distribution differently. So in Canada, British Columbia is going to perhaps look at regulating marijuana differently than Alberta. That they have different marketplaces and they view marijuana in a different way. So when we look at Colorado, I don't want to impugn their policies, but when we look at and I'll just take commercial advertising as a specific example, that the the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Canada has even suggested a public health approach by limiting our commercial advertising rules. And so really what we want to do is we want to negate the negative effects of prohibition. We want to treat Canadians like the responsible adults that they are, but we don't want to rush into legalization and say it's perhaps have increased consumption beyond what we currently have. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to take a cautious approach to show Canadians that the model can be successful.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next question will come from Ben Adlin with Leafy. Please go ahead. Mr. Adlin, please make sure your phone is not on mute.
Sorry, you got it. My phone was on mute. Thanks, David, for putting this together. Really appreciate it. I have a simple question, not necessarily an easy one. Who all was invited in terms of U.S. lawmakers, and what kind of responses did you get from them?
U.S. lawmakers, it's sort of early on the radar screen for members of Congress. Unfortunately, there was a letter which we didn't coordinate, but we supported from some members of Congress asking the administration to involve more of its branches in UNGASS and different kinds of people there, like people involved in public health and so forth. I think there is some interest certainly from the sympathetic members who've been involved in marijuana law reform. Earl Blumenauer was one of the leaders of that letter, along with John Conyers. In the executive branch, we haven't received a response to our letter other than one contact I happen to know personally did acknowledge they have it. The letter was recent, and hopefully it will get some attention within the executive branch.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. The next question will come from Doug McVeigh with KBOO Radio, Pacifica Radio Network.
Hi. And Dave, thanks for putting this together, and thank you all for being here. The pushback against reform is being led at the UN by nations like Russia and Singapore. At the recent Commission on Narcotic Drugs annual meeting, the delegate from Singapore expressed his nation's desire for, quote, a drug-free society, not a drug-tolerant one, end quote. He also said that Singapore believes in harm prevention as opposed to harm reduction. I'm wondering how would you respond?
Sorry, Doug, who were you directing the question for?
Well, one of you folks, really. You, David, or probably Don McPherson. I'd love to hear what Don would have to say.
Well, I think you summed it up. We've made a huge point over the last almost 20 years since the 1998, the last UNGASS, when the motto was a drug-free world, we can do it, by 2008. And 2008 came, and there was a lot of action around that. And I find it hard to understand really why countries are holding countries like Russia and Singapore are holding other countries hostage to actually, as one of our guests said today, modernizing the drug treaties. They really do need to be modernized, and I think the most recent round of negotiations at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs was deplorable, and the outcome document that came out of that process is quite awful. You can find some minor progressive movement towards 2016 and the scientific evidence that we have today on drugs and drug policy, but it's really alarming that this document is going to the UNGASS, and there's also a rumor that it may be adopted at the beginning of the UNGASS. Which would be, I think, a travesty and make a mockery of the whole show. So at the very least, it needs to be adopted at the end of the UNGASS. And that is why organizations and governments, some governments, are beginning to call for a mechanism post-UNGASS to get real with the situation of the modernizing of the treaties and the need for that. And I think it's really important that member states, UN member states, speak strongly for the need for that mechanism, whether it's an expert committee or some other sort of group that several countries have called for. It needs to happen before the next 3 years are critical around coming up to 2019. So we really do need that process in place to deal with the sort of intransigence of other countries, which in a consensus-based model really hold progress ransom.
I'll add to that, and this is Dave Borden. A number of Asian and Middle Eastern countries have the death penalty for nonviolent drug offenses. Iran has executed nearly 1,000 people in the last year, mostly for drug offenses. In the discussions at the UNGASS, and you can read transcripts on a website called the CND blog, published by an organization we're allied with, International Drug Policy Consortium. But a number of these countries have not only sworn their allegiance to the drug control conventions, as many countries did, including Western ones, but a number of them actively stated there's a need to oppose legalization, not go to that route. Well, these same countries are saying, the West, the UN, doesn't tell them what to do. It's their internal decision what kind of drug policies they have, and if they think that the death penalty is a proportionate punishment for nonviolent drug offenses, that's what they think. Well, they're actively telling the rest of the world that it's not okay to do legalization, so they're trying to tell the rest of us what to do. So there's nothing consistent whatsoever in the positions of these countries that are saying it's our business and that we have nothing to say in terms of human rights. The second point I'll make, and I think this point is particularly important for Europe, if we have anyone here who's writing for those audiences. The European delegations at the CND last month, for anyone who doesn't know, that's the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, a UN body with a subset of the member states, meets in Vienna. Last month was its major annual session. The European delegations fought really hard for language opposing the death penalty in this context. I believe they argued late into the night, on the last night, before a final draft document for UNGASS was finalized. But realistically, it's going to be hard to get that past China, which has the death penalty for drugs. It's probably going to. Russia will probably object to it as well. It's a fight worth fighting, but returning to this question of the treaties, legalization, and flexibility, the EU and most European governments regrettably have avoided this question in the same way that the U.S. and many other countries have. This has led to an over-reliance on the flexibility concept for what countries can do with their drug policies, as a number of us have discussed already. And that idea of flexibility, again, is being used by these countries with hardline policies to justify policies like the death penalty that violate human rights. And so this weak stance by the EU and EU member countries on the question of the treaties, flexibility, the implications of legalization, is already having some a negative rebound in terms of an issue that Europeans care very deeply about, which is stopping the death penalty. And one last thing I'll note on this is that a couple of European countries actually opposed the creation of this expert advisory group in their statements. One of those is Spain, which arguably has more than any or almost any European country at stake in this. I'm referring to Spain's cannabis social clubs. Certainly seem to call for some review and updating of the treaty. That's assuming the clubs survive scrutiny by Spain's courts, and it's unclear what will happen there. But I think that's a highly counterproductive position for the U.S. and Spain of all countries, with what's happening with our marijuana policies, to actually oppose even discussing options for treaty reform in the most important international meeting on drugs in 2 decades.
Thank you. As a quick reminder, if you have a question, please dial *1. The next question will come from Russ Belville with Cannabis Radio. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Question for the Canadian and Mexican delegations on the call. As you're probably aware, we are in the midst of the longest election season on the planet, and whether or not Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders wins on the Democratic side, we could almost guarantee that whoever wins on the Republican side won't be as friendly to marijuana reform specifically and drug law reforms in general. Do you worry about the outcomes of the U.S. election having any impact on what may or may not be decided at UNGASS in April?
So, speaking from the Canadian perspective, we made a promise in the election. We're committed to keeping that promise, and keeping that promise will have nothing to do with the outcome of the American election.
Well, I would say that at the end of the day, the states have been the ones that have been taking the decisions of legalization of uses of marijuana for recreational or of medical purposes. So I'm not sure that it will be a matter or an issue if Donald Trump, which is the expected winner of the candidature of the Republican side, if he is the candidate, I'm not sure that it will be an issue on this topic because it is on the field of the states.
Yeah, similarly to the senator's opinion, just to add, the people, organizations from civil society who are behind pushing drug policy reform, in case it was not clear in my first intervention, we will continue to push in court, both for medical and recreational purposes. So for medical one, we have several cases already. We expect our first case to go up to the Supreme Court by the end of May. And on recreational, we have another 200 cases to go. We are defending 12 of those, and we only really need 4 to do jurisprudence and finish this off. This is just to say that will happen regardless of if the legislative changes the law or not. However, I do think the legislative has good political leadership right now. There are good agreements on certain subjects, mainly medical cannabis. And I think Mexico is entering an era where we are understanding, we need to prioritize our own interests in terms of public health and public security before seeing what other countries are doing. Additionally, the U.S. opening up the possibility of doing it by doing it themselves at the state level and not prosecuting it at the federal level, I think really, gives way to many other countries to do, to experiment with policy as well.
I'll add one last thing as the U.S. representative on the call, that, it's certainly plausible that a Republican president would be more hostile to this than a Democratic president, but we don't really know that, and I think it's a sign of the times we're in that both Donald Trump and Ted Cruz have taken the position that states can and should be able to set these policies. Trump opposed that before he supported it, but I believe that's the latest position from both of them. And there's growing support on the Republican side for marijuana law reforms and sentencing reforms. We've had a whole set of good votes in the Congress that have passed. The conservative House of Representatives. Many more Democratic votes than Republican votes, but quite a few Republican votes. I think the 10th Amendment argument is an appealing one for many of the current set of Republicans, and I'd also say that even though these same people might not be so interested in or fond of the UN, the idea of changing treaties to codify that countries have some latitude, although hopefully latitude respecting human rights, is analogous, a position that's analogous to that one.
Well, I apologize, but I have to go now. I have to go to a meeting, so thank you so much, everyone, for inviting me to this conference call, and if there is any other question or doubt, I can reply on email or whatever you want. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Mr. Borden, we have no further questions at this time. Do you have any closing remarks?
Sure. I'd just like to say thank you to all the media and the remaining speakers for taking your time with us today. We would be happy to coordinate requests for follow-up interviews with any of our speakers. You can contact Tom for help with that. Tom can be reached at 202-557-4979, or by email at tomangel@gmail.com. Tom has asked me to point out there are two L's. It's TOMANGELL@gmail.com. Also, feel free to contact me directly. I'd love to speak with anyone. My number is 202-236-8620. That's my cell. And my email address is borden@drcnet.org. BORDEN@drcnet.org. All this contact info is in the advisories that were sent around before. Also, we should have an audio file available. I'm told it'll probably be available in about 2 hours, although potentially it could take until tomorrow. And we've ordered a transcript as well, and we will send out URLs for those when they are available. So thank you again. Special thank you to our speakers, and I guess we are signing off now.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's conference. You may now disconnect your lines.